The wind came restless off the prairie that morning, scattering dry leaves across the porch boards as Clara Whitfield stood by the postbox, the hem of her faded dress brushing against her ankles. She had been waiting since sunrise, her hands tucked into her shawl, heart tethered to the promise of a letter. For weeks she had written to Elias Hardiker, the wealthy rancher whose advertisements in the Regional Gazette promised stability to the right woman. She had imagined his words as a bridge out of hunger and the slow, unending winters that pressed on her and her sister. When the post finally arrived, the envelope bore his name in thick, deliberate script. She broke the seal with a quick breath. But the first line struck like a blow. Elias thanked her for her correspondence, yet declared he had found someone more suitable. She read it twice, the words colder each time, until the wind tugged the paper from her fingers and sent it tumbling into the yard. She did not chase it. She only stood there, her throat aching, aware that in a town like Dove Creek, the knowledge of her rejection would travel faster than the river in flood. By the time her older sister Martha returned from her deliveries, the shadows had lengthened across the dirt road. Martha's figure was unmistakable, tall, broad-shouldered, her stride steady as though she carried a load invisible to anyone but herself. She had been to the mercantile to deliver the week's mending, and even from a distance, Clara knew she had heard. Martha's face was calm, but there was a tightness around her eyes that told of whispers exchanged over counters and in doorways. The two of them walked back toward their small cabin, passing the church and the schoolhouse, past neighbors who found reasons to pause in their chores. A woman at the well murmured something to her companion, who covered her mouth to hide a smile. Children playing marbles stopped to watch, their mothers calling them back sharply. It wasn't cruelty so much as curiosity, sharpened by the boredom of a small western town that never forgot its stories. Clara tried to speak as they walked, to explain or pretend indifference, but Martha simply reached for her elbow and guided her forward. "Let them talk," Martha murmured, her voice a low anchor against the drift of gossip. But Clara's humiliation had already settled deep. In her mind, she could hear the whispers shaping themselves into a tale. The younger Whitfield sister, thinking herself fit for a rancher, sent away with nothing but a polite refusal. She imagined the smug satisfaction on faces that had never offered them help, and it burned like fever beneath her skin. The sun had dipped low when the sound of hoofbeats broke the evening quiet. A rider approached, the dust rising in soft plumes behind a sorrel gelding. Elias Hardacre himself dismounted before their gate, hat in hand. He was as she had pictured him, thick in the belly, with a face that had weathered sun and wind but still carried a certain authority. He greeted them with a stiffness that made Clara's heart tighten. She expected an apology, perhaps a few awkward words to ease the sting. Instead, after a pause that seemed to weigh him down, he turned his eyes not to her, but to Martha. "Your daughter needs a home," he said to her sister, "and my son needs a mother." The words landed with peculiar heaviness, and for a moment even the cicadas seemed to fall silent. He explained that the young woman from back east, the one he had chosen instead, had refused to leave her family. He needed a wife still, and Martha, he said plainly, was a woman of strength and capable hands. It was not meant as insult, but as a kind of business proposition. Clara felt the sting of it in her ribs, the odd displacement of being bypassed so neatly, as though she were a cup set aside for a sturdier vessel. Martha's first reaction was a short, incredulous laugh, more out of surprise than amusement. "You're serious," she said, searching his face. He spoke of the loneliness of his ranch, the boy growing wild without a woman's guidance, the long winter ahead. His voice softened once or twice, but the offer was as blunt as a fence post. Clara could not read her sister's expression. She only knew that this moment felt as though something was tilting the ground beneath her feet. "I'll think on it," Martha said finally, her tone neutral. Elias tipped his hat, gave a small nod, and left with the deliberate gait of a man who believed the matter nearly settled. The sound of his horse faded into the dark, leaving the sisters in a silence that was harder to bear than the words themselves. They lit the lamp inside, the cabin warm with the scent of wood smoke and bread from a noon meal. Clara tried again to sway her sister. "You don't have to do this. You deserve better than being someone's second choice." She wanted to protect Martha from the same bruising weight she herself carried now. Martha set the lamp on the table, its light shaping her face into planes and shadow. "Better," she repeated softly, as though tasting the word. "Better than what, Clara? Than another winter in this shack? Than watching you wear your fingers raw for a few coins." Her voice was steady, but Clara heard the truth in it. Martha knew the limits of her chances. She was a widow, her body broad and unsoftened by the delicate airs men like to imagine in a bride. "Men don't look twice at me unless they're sizing up a mule," she said, not bitterly, but with a certain acceptance. "At least this way we eat." They sat like that for a long while, the lamplight wavering as the wind pressed against the walls. Finally, Martha pulled her coat from its peg, inspecting the lining. "This'll need mending before morning." Clara fetched her sewing kit without another word, her fingers working in small, precise motions while her throat ached. She stitched by the flicker of light, aware with each pass of the needle that she was fastening her sister's life to another's. Dawn came cold and pale, the grass silver with frost. They walked together to the edge of town, Martha carrying a single carpet bag, Clara clutching her shawl tight. Elias was there with his wagon, its boards worn but sturdy. He greeted Martha with a nod, offered his hand to help her climb aboard. The dog barked from the back, a dark shape among the bundles. A few townsfolk loitered near the mercantile, their glances like small stones skipping across water, quick, sharp, and leaving ripples. Martha settled on the seat beside Elias, her posture straight, eyes forward. Clara stood on the packed dirt road, the cold biting through her shoes. She tried to memorize her sister's face, but the wagon was already in motion, wheels rattling over the frozen ground. She watched it roll away, shrinking against the horizon until it was no more than a moving shadow between the bare cottonwoods. When it vanished entirely, the emptiness left behind felt wider than the whole prairie. The road to the Hardacre ranch wound through low hills and open pasture, the earth pale under the brittle winter sun. Martha sat beside Elias on the wagon seat, her hands folded in her lap, her carpetbag between her boots. He spoke little, his gaze fixed ahead, the brim of his hat casting a shadow that kept his expression unreadable. The ranch came into view as a cluster of weathered buildings against a wide horizon, a big, square house with peeling white paint, two barns sagging under their own weight, and fences leaning as though the wind had been pushing them for years. There was no grandeur here, no polished railings or painted trim, only the blunt practicality of survival. A boy of about 8 stood in the yard, a wiry child with hair the color of dry wheat. He didn't wave. Instead, he pressed himself against the flank of a rangy dog that studied Martha with the same suspicion as its master. Elias gestured toward him. "That's Samuel." The boy's eyes flicked over her quickly, then dropped to the ground. An older woman stepped out onto the porch, her face drawn tight as twine. She wore an apron and carried a dish towel, her hands never still. "Mrs. Tate," Elias said, "this is Martha." The housekeeper's nod was curt, her gaze appraising but without welcome. Inside, the room smelled faintly of cold ashes and boiled beans. Supper was waiting, though it was little more than bread, a pot of stew, and strong coffee. They ate in near silence. Samuel kept his eyes on his bowl, Elias on his plate. Mrs. Tate moved like a ghost between kitchen and table. Martha's mind measured every glance, every pause, feeling the weight of being tested without anyone saying so. When the meal ended, Elias muttered something about checking the stock and left. Samuel slipped away behind him, leaving Martha alone with the scrape of Mrs. Tate's cleaning. The woman did not speak again that night. The days fell into a rhythm shaped by labor. Martha rose before dawn to stoke the stove, to brew coffee before the men headed out to the pastures. Samuel would appear in the kitchen doorway, his hair sticking up like dry thistle, never speaking until he had eaten. She didn't force conversation, but she began to leave small things for him: a mended cuff, an extra spoonful of jam, a piece of string wound neatly for his pocket. At first he accepted them without acknowledgement, but one morning she found a polished stone resting on the edge of her plate, its smooth surface catching the light. Later, it was a wildflower, the petals already wilting but carefully placed. These quiet offerings passed between them without words, yet each seemed to chip away at the wall the boy had built. The gossip from town arrived in low tones from the ranch hands, carried on the same wind that rattled the barn doors. Martha heard her name followed by snickers, mentions of her size, of the bargain marriage struck after Elias's first choice failed. She absorbed it without outward reaction, but in the barn or the yard she worked harder, mending fence posts alongside the men, hauling water until her arms ached. Samuel began to follow her on small errands, the dog at his heels. He still spoke sparingly, but his eyes lingered on her longer now, as if testing the shape of trust. One late afternoon, the sky shifted. Clouds the color of iron rolled over the hills, and the air took on the sharp, metallic smell of snow. By the time Elias returned from the far pasture, the wind was slicing through the yard, carrying the first flurry sideways. Mrs. Tate was already latching the shutters when someone noticed Samuel was missing. The boy had last been seen heading toward the south pasture with the dog, chasing after something. Elias swore under his breath and went to saddle his horse, but Martha was already pulling on her coat. "You won't find him sitting here," she said, swinging into the saddle before Elias could object. The storm closed around her like a fist, snow blinding her eyes, wind clawing at her face. She called Samuel's name, the sound snatched away by the gale. Hoofbeats sank deep into drifts that grew by the minute. She spotted the dog first, a dark shape against the whiteness. Then the boy, crouched against a fallen trunk of cottonwood, his arms locked around the shivering animal. His lips were pale, his eyes dull with cold. Martha slid from the saddle, wrapping him in her coat, tucking him close to her body. She led the horse on foot, letting it bear Samuel's weight, trudging back through the snow until the house's shadow rose from the white haze. Inside, Elias stoked the fire high while Martha stripped off the boy's wet boots and rubbed his hands until color returned. Samuel clung to her, his head against her shoulder. "Ma!" he murmured, half asleep. The words struck her harder than the wind had. Elias stood watching, his eyes unreadable, but he laid a hand on her shoulder, warm and steady. Nothing was said, but something shifted there in the quiet, something heavier than gratitude. In the weeks that followed, Samuel's reserve melted like the snow on the eaves. He began to seek her out, to help with chores, to leave his small tokens on her table without secrecy. Elias spoke more to her, about the ranch, about Samuel's schooling, about the repairs he had put off for years. Mrs. Tate's sharpness softened, if only in small ways. An extra biscuit on Martha's plate, a shared glance that lacked its earlier judgment. But the town's eyes remained watchful. On a supply trip to Dove Creek, Martha heard them before she saw them. Two women near the mercantile door, their voices carrying. They spoke of her size, of how Elias had settled for the other sister, their laughter brittle as dry corn husks. She might have walked past, but Samuel was there beside her, his hand in hers. He turned, face flushed, ready to speak, but Elias was already there, his voice cutting through the street. "This woman rode into a storm to bring my boy home," he said, his tone flat, but carrying to every ear in the square. "She's worth 10 of any gossiping tongue in this town." The women faltered, their smirks slipping away. Around them, others turned back to their business, their eyes avoiding hers, not out of shame but out of a new, grudging respect. Martha felt Samuel's hand tighten in hers, his chin lifted a little higher. Elias looked at her then, not as a compromise, but as someone claimed. The air between them held a quiet acknowledgement, an understanding that no letter could have carried. On the ride back, the prairies stretched under sky washed clean by winter light. Samuel leaned against her, half dozing, and Elias kept the wagon steady over the rutted road. She watched the horizon, the pale gold of it bending into blue, and thought of how lives had turned on small acts, a coat wrapped against the cold, a word spoken at the right moment. Out here, love didn't arrive with ribbons or grand decorations. It came in storms, in mended fences, in the weight of a hand that stayed. And sometimes, she realized, being the second choice was only the beginning of being chosen.